It's a Minefield is an audio exploration produced by us, people who ride the waves of mental and emotional distress.
Our expertise comes from our lived experience, and these are the stories you'll hear, along with those who are on the journey with us.
The roller coaster of mental health can be lonely and overwhelming, but we're all in this together and would love for you to join us. Hey, Hannah.
Hey, Leon.
How you going?
Good, how are you?
I'm okay. I'm curious. I got a question for you.
Mm.
Have you ever felt lonely?
Fuck yeah.
Tell us about it.
I think there's like a strain of loneliness that's always running through me. I don't know, like as a single person living in the world, I think that there's like, I'm always just like a little bit sad that I'm like one person just going through life. It would be nice to have another person just doing life with me, and I think that is always a little bit lonely. But I also think that in this world where we're seemingly so connected, social media, all that crap, that I feel like we've also never been more disconnected from each other. It's like that sense of community has really kind of dissipated over the years. And there's like online communities which I'm like are helpful for people, but I still feel like there's that lack of human connection, which results in a lot of people feeling really lonely, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, I chatted to Chris. Hey, Chris.
Hey, Leon. Hey, Hannah.
We spoke a bit about romantic loneliness too, and also the idea about being lonely in a crowded city. And I think you had something to say about Disney.
I did. Disney, yeah.
But yeah, I feel that too. Hey, as someone who's sporadically in relationships and mostly single too, you know, the joy of companionship, you know. But Chris kindly offered a really great testimony and a bit of a chat about his experiences of loneliness that I'm looking forward to hearing. Then I had the pleasure of talking to Australia's scientific expert on loneliness, Dr. Michell Lim, and it was a really great conversation.
Well, shall we have a listen?
Let's
do it.
Okay, yes, let's.
Loneliness. I think it's such a universal thing that can feel like you're the only person experiencing it. Even the most social person or socially connected person can feel really lonely. It's like this deep kind of emptiness or hole that's there. The difference between being alone and being lonely. I think being alone, it's possible to feel content or kind of not isolated. And being lonely can happen when you are alone and also when you're with people. Being lonely is like disconnection. I'm very lucky to be living in a big city, and since I was particularly in my sort of late teens and adulthood, I've developed a really strong, varied like network of close friends and things like that. And I know logically I'm really lucky to have that, and a lot of people don't have that. But often I struggle to reach out to those friends, especially when I'm struggling mentally myself. And when I am with them, I feel not 100% connected, and I feel lonely and trapped in my head and kind of isolated. And I guess that's more the isolation of going through social anxiety maybe, because more often than not, like worrying about what friends will think of me, if I'm saying the right thing, if I'm going to disappoint them, if they like me, if somebody's like, if a friend is, you know, short with me or something like that, or frustrated, which is totally fucking normal. If I'm not feeling well and I'm feeling like quite anxious, I'll analyze that of like, oh, they don't like me, they just feel sorry for me. Like they don't like my company, you know, they can't wait for this time hanging out to be over. Like, and I think part of that could be protective, like not wanting to be vulnerable and feeling like I have to be the best version of myself around my friends or around the people that I love. but I do struggle to accept that. And I think that probably stems from a lack of self-acceptance and self-love and loving myself even at my quote-unquote worst. So I feel like I've got to be good, or I feel like I've got to be a certain way for people to like me. And sometimes putting on the happy cloak or putting on the happy face, people will respond positively, and then I'll feel positive for a short time. But then there's this underlying, like, almost like a toxic kind of feeling of like, oh fuck, I can't keep doing this. Oh fuck, this is so fake. And then I beat myself up about it. I think the idea that you can be most alone in a crowded city is true. I think I find comfort in busyness and being around people. I feel the loneliest probably like I live alone, and I've done that for a couple of years. Often at home is quite lonely, and I feel quite like shut off from the world. And that could be a home in the middle of the city. Like, I don't live too far from the city. I struggle to find the motivation to do things when I'm by myself. I just sort of lay around, scroll on my phone, that kind of thing. It feels like a lot of pointless wasting time. I think there's absolutely a lot of internal barriers that contribute to my experience of loneliness. I do feel lonely a lot. I think it's something I felt a lot as a child. My parents, they're quite introverted people. So I think I grew up in an environment that didn't like really normalize socializing or like being loud or being like extroverted or anything like that. I remember mum saying, oh, we're just quiet people. And by we, she meant like the whole family. Oh, we're quiet, we're shy. Like, that was kind of the identity. I was quite a shy, introverted kid. I think I was, pecking order-wise, like the lowest in the group or whatever. And I wasn't very assertive. So I think that definitely added to like a sense of loneliness. I really felt it heavily for the first time. Like, a really good friend of mine from when I was about 6 or 7, like we lived very close to each other. Like, we saw each other every day. She was, one of my first crushes. Like, we spent so much time together, and just really, it felt like she was one of the first people to really get me. And I feel like I got her as well. And like, it was just a really cool connection. Like, I've got you, Olivia, like on my side, and you're fucking cool, and I'm so glad you're my friend. And that was a really like empowering feeling. And I guess soon after that, like when I was about 13, Olivia's went through like her family went through like a divorce. Their parents got divorced, so she kind of just suddenly disappeared, and I didn't know what was happening. She just suddenly wasn't at home a bunch, and so she just kind of disappeared from my life. And I remember feeling so lonely then, like so deeply lonely. Like, this is somebody I spent most days with. And that was probably the first time I recognized feeling like depression, like, or just like this really heavy feeling of like, life's fucking hard and life is like awful. And I didn't feel able to talk about it with anybody. I think I'd like to grow more comfortable in my own company, and then therefore be able to enjoy other people's company more. Like, after my childhood friend Olivia just kind of disappeared and I lost that connection, I went through a period of like not having many friends at all, particularly in like high school where like you spend most of your time. And then I found like a small group of friends. And I remember after finding that, I felt such relief. And I remember thinking that like, no matter what, I'm never going to not have like friendship connections. And this is the most important thing in my life. And that's what I decided at like 15 or something. And I think I can see what 15-year-old me was doing, but I think that's made me struggle with boundaries and stuff sometimes, because it's like, you want people in your life no matter what. So sometimes if someone's being an asshole or not treating you well, you might still have them in your life. I don't know if it's any one person's responsibility. I think it's like a community responsibility. I think living in a big city and things like that, it is that sense of like being anonymous and nobody really knows anybody. Yeah, so it's like, it's easy to see people and be around people, but maybe harder to develop a close relationship because we live such solitary lives in that don't really know many of our neighbours or people living in our street or in our community. And that's a huge generalisation. In terms of connections with people more generally, I really do enjoy just talking to random people and having random conversations with people that I might never see again. And I do live with a lot of social anxiety, but I do find that kind of refreshing and recharging. Yeah, and it might be just a 15-minute interaction, but those kind of connections, those brief kind of connections that can be really meaningful, I find they can change a whole day for me, or have a big change in my mood. We lost Kaz, our producer, last year to suicide, and that is something that I'm still processing, and I know a lot of people are still processing, whatever that means. I think after Kaz died, it was a big comfort in a way to link up with her friends and connect with them. It's like sharing something really awful to go through, like the loss of Kaz. So sharing something fucking horrible. And it's also acknowledging the person that we've lost and the shared grief and the shared feelings and the shared missing and the shared... It's there is a sense of community, I find, that comes from grief. And that is really complex. And I've said to a couple of Kaz's friends, and certainly thought it myself, I just wish we met at a party. I wish we met at Kaz's 33rd birthday, or, a Mardi Gras party or something like that. And I wish that was the story, but it's not. When it comes to romantic attachment, I think I really struggle with loneliness a lot, because I've seen, or I believed since I was a kid, and it's still I know logically it's not true, but it's still one of those core kind of gut beliefs that hey, I just meet the right person and I'll never feel lonely again, or I'll never feel that deep despair. And I'm if I meet the right person, then they're gonna help me not feel that. And I know that's fucking selfish, and nobody can do that. I can't do that for anybody. Nobody can do it for me. But sometimes I get caught in that magic thinking, or a lot of the time I get caught in that magic thinking of hey, maybe this romantic attachment, maybe this romantic encounter, or this relationship will make everything okay. And then it doesn't, and then it reinforces the loneliness. We're definitely taught that by Disney. And I remember loving that idea. And I remember thinking, hey, even if I feel really alone right now and really lonely right now, I'm going to meet this amazing person and they're going to make everything complete. And that's exactly what Disney tells you. And that's what, my parents told me as well. And the whole world tells you. And part of me was yeah, that's not the complete picture. But part of me kind of bought into it. And a big part of me bought into it. So sometimes in a relationship, when it's starting, or when things are really exciting and stuff like that, then it's oh, yay, this solves everything. I don't need to go to therapy anymore. I don't need to take antidepressants. I don't need to work on myself. And then, that phase ends or, changes. And then it's oh, I'm back here. So I think I'm trying to date more consciously and to be hey, it's okay if things don't feel yay, you're completing me instantly. And it's okay for things to develop slowly. And it's okay to feel lonely when you're with a partner. And it's okay to feel people don't always understand you. That's what I'm trying to learn. What would my best self say to the self that's struggling with doubt? And that is also my best self. Let's be controversial. That's the first thing I'd say. I'd be hey, even when you're filled with that doubt, you're still your best self. That's exactly what I'd say. And I would be hey, you're okay. You're valued and loved, whatever you're doing, whether you're around people, whether you're not, whether you're having a really good day, whether you're having a really shit day. And hey, the people that do care for you and love you will be there for you whatever the day, whatever you're going through. That's what I'd say.
Okay, so I'm really delighted to once again chat with Dr. Michell Lim, who is considered Australia's leading scientific expert in loneliness. And I guess the first question, of the myriad of scientific pursuits one could follow, what made you dedicate your career to loneliness?
Leon, that's a fantastic question. I think as a trained clinical psychologist, who've been doing this work for the last 19 years, what I really found, I guess, fascinating was the gap between what I could offer as a clinical psychologist versus what others could outside the service industry. And I was working with people with very significant serious mental illness for part of my career. And whilst we saw them 2-3 times a day, we would check in, or they might be living with family or friends or in group homes, they would always complain about loneliness. And I think that no matter what we did as a service, no matter what we did within mental health, the truth of the matter is that our mental health services are just not catered to actually addressing loneliness in a way that people who we assist need that care. So that really kind of led me to research this issue a lot more, and really try to understand how we can narrow that gap. What is it that we can do if we were to work in the service industry and the care industry? What can we do to actually help the people that we're trying to help to nurture meaningful social connection?
Yeah, it's so interesting, loneliness, because I think the UK has a minister for loneliness, and loneliness is such an existential thing. Like we could have we can have interventions for hepatitis B, or for democracy, or for human rights, marriage equality. Loneliness is so existential, almost nebulous. How would you define loneliness?
We've come a long way in terms of how we think about loneliness. And now the current thinking is that loneliness is really what we call subjective feeling of social isolation. And I say subjective, it's very much the person's perception of how their current social needs are not actually met with the current relationships that they currently hold, be it quantity, but mostly around quality. So again, this differs from age groups to age groups. So for some people, it's very much that you do want more, but that for most people, it's really very much that they want high quality and more meaningful social connection.
So interesting. It makes me reflect about a lot of things. And one of those things is, it is about connection. It's about the qualities of connection. What's the difference between being alone and loneliness?
That's a good question. And I think that's where people get confused, because they use those terms really interchangeably. Being alone and being physically alone doesn't necessarily mean that you are lonely. In fact, there's quite a bit of research as well that have said that people who do live alone, for example, actually have much more enriched social networks, because they actually know how to cope with being alone, living by themselves, actually make much more of an effort to actually have those meaningful social connections. Whereas if you are lonely, you could be living with people, surrounded by others, working in big organizations and embedded in big institutions, or living with family, or being married, but still feel a sense of disconnection. So feeling like we're both speaking the same language, but we're not really aligned to each other. We're not really getting each other. Perhaps there's less trust within those relationships. You'll think twice before confiding in those people. You feel like despite having people around you, you don't feel like you can turn to them or talk to them. So you feel very reluctant to do those things. So loneliness and aloneness are absolutely very different and should not be used interchangeably.
It makes me think of the idea that some of the most lonely experiences I've had, and you can be most lonely in a crowded city. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. I used to live in the States, and I was very lucky to live in the Midwest. And I say that because most of my friends who live in the East Coast, like New York City, And I absolutely love going to New York, but they used to complain that New York was the loneliest city they've ever lived in.
Really?
Yes, and one of the biggest reasons why they attribute it to this way is that people are transient. They come into New York, they leave New York. So it's about going, do I really want to invest in making friends with this person that might move on, 2 months down the line, because everyone's transient. And despite living in this bustling city, it was very difficult to date. It was very difficult to make friends. Whereas I was living in the Midwest, and I was happy because it was a community. It was people really embrace this Australian person coming from overseas and was fascinated and wanted to learn more. They were inclusive. I was invited to many parties. I was living a completely different life to most of my friends living in New York. So I think there's something about, the sense of community that we live in and the culture that can add to loneliness.
When you talk about community, I think so much about neighborhood. And we talk about neighbors and knowing our neighbors. And I was contemplating too, in some of my darker times experiencing depression, I know the guys who work at Mitre 10 down the road. I know the guys who serve me groceries. I don't even know their names, but when you say g'day and those sorts of things, they're the most superficial of interactions, but they make such a huge difference. And I didn't really notice that until it really affected me in the most beautiful way.
I think that people started to appreciate the importance of minute social interactions during the pandemic, because you remember at one point we were not allowed to talk to people, and hi and bye was a rare occasion. And people felt like those minute social interactions, even though they weren't friends with that person, or even this importance of small talk that we used to do and banter we used to do with strangers. When that was taken away, I think people just realized, oh, that actually did contribute to my well-being. That actually made a difference. And I always give the example of how I used to make these very, very minute social interactions with the guy that actually collects money from me when I, get out of the car park. And each time, and how quickly we have to pay and get out of the way. Each time I will build on that social interaction from the day before.
Yeah.
And that minute social interaction got deeper and deeper because I was doing that regularly. And soon I knew, his wife's name, what kind of car he was going to buy. You get into all those details because those things that started off as hi and bye became this conversation that can actually drag on for a few months. And I really appreciated how we can actually grow those things if we actually make the effort.
Whose responsibility is it to end loneliness?
Well, all of us. I think this is the thing that, and I think the very, very rare silver lining of COVID is that most of us who didn't think that we would feel lonely before have actually felt at least this thing of loneliness at some point during the pandemic. People forget actually that could happen to them. And this idea of, just because I'm working and I'm young and I have got lots of friends, people don't realize that could change very quickly. And that could change as a matter of fact of just the course of your life, whether you're moving to a new country for a great job, whether you've lost someone or break up an intimate relationship. Those things can change very quickly. And I think that it's really important for us to remember and have the empathy, even if we didn't feel chronically or distressingly lonely at the moment, that it could happen to us, and that we have a responsibility to help other people as well, whether it's talking to our neighbors and saying hi, all the way to checking with a friend. We can all do something. We don't need any policy to guide us to say that we have to do these things. We can actually make the effort to do those things. And it's not just good for our community well-being, it's actually good for us, because we know that feeling socially connected is actually good for our health and well-being across so many different things.
Which groups in society are more vulnerable to loneliness?
Yeah. Look, we do know, first of all, all of us will experience loneliness at some point, but when we look at the data, so we're looking at large epidemiological data sets, both national and international data, it's very consistent trends in terms of people of lower socioeconomic status tend to feel more lonely. So you have lower income, which is really kind of, makes me curious about how this current financial stresses at the moment that we have is actually affecting people. People with chronic disease, so whether it's physical or mental, tend to actually be of higher risk. And if you think about this, is really around their mobility, their ability to actually get the time to socialize and maintain meaningful social connections, as opposed to being impaired, with their daily routine, whether they have to see the doctor or just not being able to get out in the community. Single parents, for example, is another very vulnerable group. So I think people again assume you have a child, and you shouldn't feel lonely. But actually, when you do care for people like a child or an elderly parent, that actually means that you're not taking care of your own social needs. So again, a lot of these things are just part and parcel of life. We can't choose to not be a single parent, those sort of things. And then there are other things that are barriers that, people don't have control over. So, low income, for example, or living in a more deprived neighborhood, those are kind of systemic barriers. So while I say it's really normal to feel lonely, what happens is that some of us stay lonely because of these barriers that we have absolutely very little control over.
One of my paradoxical experiences during lockdown as someone who's thought they were an extrovert, now I identify as a gregarious introvert, was the joy of solitude. The joy of solitude is something I never really understood. But I do remember in my teens and 20s, I'd always have a posse. I'd go overseas for 2 weeks and I'd have a big party and there'd be 60 people at the pub. Now I'm 45 and it's really hard to, sometimes, especially if you're sober up, it's really hard, like to make new friends. How do we find a tribe, or how do you make a superficial connection meaningful?
Yeah. Well, Leon, what you're actually describing there is actually, I guess, the change and the dynamic changes in our friendship structures and social structures as we age.
Yeah, right.
When you're younger, we tend to value lots and lots of friends, but maybe they're not as high quality friendships. And as we get older, they compress. And we try to really rely on just a handful of people, whether it's because of time or preferences or the fact that we're maybe more confident in our ability to navigate the landscape. Making friends is actually incredibly difficult as you get older. And it's, again, because if you're trying to make friends with your same peer age group, it might be that people are raising families or they're so busy with their careers. People are not making time anymore. They're not actually putting in the effort. They're chasing something else, and I think that one of the biggest barriers to actually making those meaningful friendships is that simply because we don't prioritize it and we don't actually make the effort anymore. I think that given that loneliness is now really recognized as a public health priority, and really the next public health priority that we're facing, it's really important that we think about how our actions can actually add to that loneliness, or whether it's within ourselves or with other people. So I often say that, again, this is not just speaking to people who are lonely, it's also people who are less lonely. And I say the word less lonely specifically because it's on the spectrum. All of us will feel it at some point. That we really need to think about how to make time and the effort to actually find your tribe. There's lots and lots of billions of people out there. It is a trial and error. I almost feel that, especially as you get older, you're going to be more selective. You're going to go, I don't really want to join a knitting group. That's not me. And that's fine. That's okay. But there's lots and lots of people who are kind of also looking for the same level of connection. Remember, at least 1 in 4 and potentially higher of us, experience problematic levels of loneliness at any given time. There will be people needing that same similar connection. And if you're not finding that tribe, it could be that you're looking at the wrong place. It's revising, okay, what is it that I actually need? Or do I want to really be in that tribe that maybe perhaps I don't feel belonged, and really revising and thinking about, what do I need? What is it that I can do? What is it that I have access to? And actually going from there. And I know a lot of people really, really do back social media and do talk about the digital means as almost maybe the cause of loneliness, but actually we can use that tool to curate and actually narrow down, groups that we might actually try. And again, it's okay to feel awkward when you actually try to find your own tribe, I have to say. It's almost a series of, this feels really uncomfortable and I don't know what I'm doing, but to kind of give things a go and trying those things out. And you don't have to like it, but you have to try to actually then figure out whether you do connect with someone within that group, or whether there's a potential friend or acquaintance that you can make into a friend. So it's difficult, and it's about sieving and finding and using tools to help us better direct us to trying to find our tribe and to find people who are like-minded.
Finding a tribe is so important. It really resonates, doesn't it? I'd define a tribe as someone with, I guess, fundamentally shared values, maybe similar demographics, but it's got something to do with the values and your willingness to connect, and what do you call it? Like your intentions in connection. Often in workplaces, there's a finance. You're turning up to the same place because you're both earning an income, and you can make deep, close connections there. But to find a tribe can be really difficult.
Unfortunately, there's no quick cure, but what I do find that's been quite helpful for a lot of people is actually mastering the art of small talk. And I know that kind of sounds a bit strange, but I think what small talk does is actually performs a function. And it performs a function in that you actually get a sense from the other person where they're at. And they get a sense of where you're at, and it might be it sounds so superficial, and people often say, I really hate small talk. But they perform a function. They give you an insight of whether that person's open to connection. They give you insight of their values sometimes, into their life, whether you might like the person or not like the person over time. And it's okay to absolutely do small talk in a way that you know how to. And some people do have to practice because they might be a bit shy, and that's okay. But giving people that opportunity to and letting people know that if you do want that connection, letting them figure out that opportunity as well, or tell them that you're open to connection, and actually being kind of more open about those things. So I think that that's the first step. And it's a very small first step and seems very superficial, but it is about gauging. It's about, is this person right for me? Or is it a good fit to actually get to know them a bit better? And then start to build on that. We don't have to do any big actions. If you think about our deepest friendships and relationships, they tend to happen over time. They tend to be small little things that happen over time, as opposed to one massive event that means that you're bonded together.
Yeah.
And this is probably why school has been very much a safe space for a lot of people, because you go to the same school year in, year out, you interact with the same people, and that relationship grows over time. So for us really to adjust our expectations of maybe we're just making acquaintances for now, or maybe we're changing an acquaintance to a friend, or maybe we're just improving the quality of a relationship that I might have with my cousin. Those little things all add up, and they don't have to always be a new friend. It can be about an existing family relationship that you just want to bring closer together.
Yeah. I was nodding enthusiastically about your talk about small talk. I was having a argument with a person, a loving argument with someone I met at a party, and who was saying just how much they hated small talk. And I couldn't put my words around why I didn't necessarily like it, but I thought it was terribly important. And it is about, I mean, you can't start a conversation with, tell me about your childhood trauma, tell me about your dead mum. You do need to, you need to sniff each other out first. Small talk you're like sharing energy. You're sharing the most simple facts, and it if nothing else, it just decorates the silence,
Absolutely. And sometimes it doesn't have to be many words. It could be a smile, it could be open body language, it could be a nod, and it could be showing interest with action, and I think that so for those people who are not great at small talk, they don't always have to rely too much on the words, but action or smiling and openness and behavior also signals to other people whether you are open for connection or not. So I think it's using a variety of different things that make sense. And and again, I think you're right, you can't just delve into please tell me about your whole childhood, because it's just absolutely going to make people retreat, and also it makes the other person awkward, and it's just not going to work. So I think it's around easing into those conversations, taking it to come and not forcing it. And again, it's I think people sometimes so desperately want to make a friend that they're actually maybe just going so full on that it does scare people off. So it's about how to pull back and assess and revise and understand that, hey, if that person doesn't want to be friends with you, it's got nothing to do with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just that they're probably not someone in your tribe. That's okay. Yeah.
If we do imagine someone is lonely, or how could we approach them while respecting their privacy? They might just be a happy introvert.
Yeah, and we don't know that. So I think the best thing is to ask, and you can ask in a way that makes sense to you and to your personality. I tend to go, hey, let me know when you want to chat, when you want to connect. It'd be lovely to see you in person. And of course, not all of us always have the time to do that. So just be very careful to say, if you do ask those things, to actually do follow up, because it's actually very important. But you can ask people if they want the opportunity to connect more deeply in a way that's much more positive, if they're not really, if you're not very sure. At this stage, and I'm glad that we're talking about loneliness. At this stage, when I say the word loneliness, people think that's their fault. They think there's something wrong with them. They think that it's because that they are not worthy of friendship, or that they think that if I'm lonely, I just don't want to be a burden to other people. Our community has just not yet fully understand the word loneliness as really an innate signal for us to connect with each other, so that we can thrive and flourish. They see it as a problem with the individual, as that it's the individual's problem, and therefore they're lonely. And this is coming from years and years of misconceptions in the media. Even I would have to say the scientific field, who used to research loneliness as some sort of neurotic personality, which means you can't change, which is actually not true. This is our scientific research has gone and leaps and bounds, away from that kind of much more, crystallized trait that there's nothing you can do about loneliness. We now know, loneliness is actually just similar to feeling hungry or feeling thirsty. It is your human checklist and signal for you to just go, oh, I'm going to need people around us, or I need a connection. And this idea that we have to be independent all the time is actually not helpful, because in reality, all of us, even if you're an introvert, all of us are interdependent on each other.
100%. So if we can perceive that pang of loneliness as our body, psyche, whatever, saying, I'd like connection, as opposed to I'm a loser, it's another way of just reading something that's almost biological. Yes. And
if we don't change our thinking, this is where we get into trouble. This is where we know that if you're lonely, it's normal, but it's not normal to stay lonely. So what's keeping us lonely is this stigma and this idea that, we don't want to be a burden to other people.
Yeah.
When we stay lonely, and we know from the research that when we are more persistently lonely, it actually it increases our likelihood of an earlier death. It actually means that we're actually going to suffer more physical and mental illnesses down the track. So it's not so much about just, I guess what's really increasing the likelihood of poor health is really that we choose to stay lonely. We choose to keep our loneliness as a silent issue. And that's probably why, many people talk about loneliness as a silent epidemic, because we just don't share if we are lonely.
Isn't it weird? Because it's something that most of us will experience at some point in our life, and by the nature of it, well, not by the nature of it, by the culture of it, we don't talk about it. How do we continue destigmatizing this normal human experience?
Yeah, Leon, good question. I really think that all of us should have some sort of awareness of what it is, what is not, how to help, how to empower, how to talk about loneliness in a way that's not that's respectful. That actually empowers people who are lonely to say, "Oh yeah, I'm lonely. I would love to connect with you, Leon. Do you have time?" We don't feel ashamed of asking. We already know that people who are lonely, they tend to do what we call soft ask, like, "Oh, Leon, are you free for coffee? If you're not, don't worry about it." And they ask in such a way that makes other people not respond. And he'll be fine. He said, "Don't worry about it," but actually, you really need it. The more of us that understand that we all have a role to play, I think that and what it is, the more we destigmatize it, the more we actually normalize it, and the more we empower people to say, "Hey, I'm lonely," and it's like saying, "Hey, I'm hungry. Let's go for a bite. Hey, I'm lonely. Let's connect." It should just be part and parcel of our lingo.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, it's the same with despair. Even suicidality shouldn't be considered aberrations of sick people, but a normal human experience. Quite an intense one, but it's a human experience. I think that's incredibly, incredibly important. One thing I'm interested in is romance, being single. Does being in a relationship, is that a panacea to loneliness?
I think that's a fantastic question, because there's also one that's also quite difficult to answer. And I'd love to tackle this. I think for many people, the presence of an intimate relationship validates their worthiness. And we do see from large epidemiological data is that people who are married do report less loneliness. But that said, we do know married people can be lonely in a marriage, right? So what we see in the data, so big data, is that married people tend to be more protected. But the need for an intimate loneliness is a very normal one. I think some people might say, it's overemphasized. It probably is to a degree, but the need for that is actually a very, very innate, signal, and again, another human need. So, as a psychologist and kind of from the putting on my clinician hat, a lot of people are lonely because they don't have that intimate partner, and it's a bit of a journey for them to try to find that intimate partner. And while they can buffer the impact of loneliness with lots of family and friends, many people still very much highly value that intimate relationship.
I've thought about this for a few years, and I try to enact this. We will grow old with our friends. That's something that will happen. We'll grow old with our close friends. And so to invest in friendships is really valuable. To invest in romantic relationships is valuable too. But sometimes I used to rely on, the romantic relationship, the boyfriend, the partner. That's the grow old bit. but all these close friends of mine I just don't consider that way. I wonder if we should raise the status of our friends, our close friends, to the guys we'll grow old with.
Yes, and this is what psychologists tend to refer as complexity, and that when one leg falls over, at least you have many other things to kind of stand on, and I think that it's not just investing in our same age friendships, but also people who are younger and people who are older, because different generations teach us different things. And
totally,
we do grow old, we also do lose our friends.
Yeah.
Are the same age. And I find that the people who thrive and flourish are the ones who have, different groups of friends who they rely on different things. And the complexity of those networks mean that they're very much protected, and nothing will ever take away the pain of a loss of an intimate relationship, but they do much better because they have that complex social support systems that can hold them up when they have a social challenge that they have to face.
My favorite part of being in an interrelationship is actually companionship. That's my favorite value, even more than sex, and that's probably why I'm always single. I'm bad in bed, but I'm a good mate. But companionship I value incredibly highly, and I love that about relationships. Can I ask you, what's your personal experience of loneliness?
Well, that's a good question. I have to pick one of many. Well, I think probably the most profound one, I think, was, and the one that really stuck with me the most, I think, was actually moving as an adult to the US, and having a very established network and family and friends over here in Melbourne. And then really just taking off. And I didn't move by myself, mind you. I moved with my partner. So I wasn't alone, but being extracted from my community, where I felt belong, and just, plopping me in the middle of the Midwest, in St. Louis, who is a fantastic city, but, it's a very different way of living. And having work friends, yes, absolutely, and no issues there. But, having to navigate the cultural landscape, the new ways of making friends, how do I put myself out there in a way that means that we can build those connections quickly? I think I got lucky, to be honest. It's not just the fact that the Midwest was a much more friendly city, but I think that, knowing one person then led to another, and then led to a network, then led to a neighborhood. But that actually took a lot of effort. I'm just really, well-known introvert. I very much like my own space, but even then I felt lonely. But I remember kind of having to go from, after working, I was working in the lab, doing research over there in the US, knocking up at 5:30, and then actually doing things with people, until 10 p.m. at night, which is very hard for an introvert.
It's a nightmare.
It's very hard, yeah. But I made the effort because I really felt like I needed to connect. I needed to people, different kinds of people with different backgrounds. And it paid off, but it wasn't without effort. And I remember coming home to my partner. He at that stage, he didn't have a job, and I could see how lonely he was, and very much an extrovert. And I made the effort because I knew that if we didn't build our networks, it wasn't going to work. He was suffering, and eventually, we found our tribe, but it took a lot of work to find your tribe. And now I kind of look back at that time with fondness, and it's been more than 10 years since I lived there, but we still keep in touch with a few friends, which, lots of people have moved on, but there are friendships that we still have because we made such a huge effort, and we stayed close. And even after moving away, we made the effort. We visited, we texted, we called. We never wanted to let those friendships go. And while all of us in a different stage of life, it doesn't matter because, relationships and friendships wax and wane. They people kind of are very close, or they kind of, drift further apart. And that's okay. But it's always about keeping in touch so that, we don't lose the opportunity to completely disconnect.
Tell me about the work of Ending Loneliness Together, your organization.
So Ending Loneliness Together is a national organization that's actually made up of around 39 different not-for-profits, corporate sectors, and smaller neighborhood organizations that have recognized that loneliness is an issue in their community. And all of them have done something, really a lot of them is their core business, that they really want to reduce loneliness and social isolation in their community. And, we recognize that we're all doing something, but we don't really have this common foundation to function on. And also many of them didn't have the access to the latest evidence or what works, what doesn't work. And so what Ending Loneliness Together is really trying to do is to work with the university sector to narrow that gap of what we know in the science, which sometimes never ever see the light of day, by the way, in the ivory tower, and it never gets translated into what I call practice and things that we're doing in real life, or even the policies that we do. So, or the policies that we have that actually, direct the way we live and interact with each other. There's a massive disconnect. We know, for example, that loneliness and social isolation are not the same thing. But to this day, we have a lot of people in practice, and it's not of their fault that they don't know. It's because we keep these things, unrelatable, and we don't translate them properly into actually what's going to work in practice and in policy. So Ending Loneliness Together just tries to narrow that gap. So it's really a very nice marriage, I would say, of the scientists, in which I can straddle both worlds, and also as in industry, what we should be doing, whether it's the care service industry or whether it's the corporate sector. What can we really do to actually improve the well-being or social well-being of people that we actually care for or actually, are part of. And
when you were talking about that, one thing I love is that loneliness hasn't been pathologized. It hasn't been given a term like disorder or syndrome, but it's been described as an epidemic. So it's been through that sociological lens, which is, something I'm strongly biased to. And it is, as I said, it's a mixture of it merges existential, sociological, philosophical, scientific, biological, all of that's like it's there like hope. It straddles so many worlds, and I love that. I love that it's. I hope that it doesn't get medicalized as a. No. Doesn't appear in the DSM at some point or another. Doesn't medications.
I'm with you, Leon, and I think actually that we should be talking about prevention of what I call more persistent loneliness, and that we should be thinking about building our society, our communities in such a way that it prevents us from actually feeling chronically or very distressingly lonely. We don't. What we do much better at is always what we call the intervention end, which is let's tackle it when people are really unwell. When they actually do have the problem of highly distressed. But actually, I think what's really not looked at is really that community upstream way where we can actually, make the effort to actually connect much better with our community and our networks before we even get to stress. And we know it's much, much more difficult to do that, what we call the intervention end. It's just much more difficult and much more expensive and much more effort, and not always very successful when we do it that way.
Yeah. Do you have any take-home messages or anything else to add?
I think what all of us can do today and starting today is really learn more about what loneliness is, not even just to help other people, but for ourselves. I think that we're taking things for granted that we're not going to feel lonely or highly distressingly lonely. And I think learning about how to speak about loneliness in a way that doesn't make the other person feel ashamed or you feel ashamed to own it in a way that you're proud of being able to say, hey, I'm lonely, I would like to connect, not have that negative connotation that comes with that when you do say that. To really understand how to help appropriately at the right time, in the right place, how to have conversations, how to build meaningful relationships over time. While we're talking about loneliness like, oh, it's not going to happen to me, it's happening to a lot of people right now.
Absolutely.
That for us, we have to really keep that in mind if we really want a healthy Australia that we can live in. Other than for people to really engage with understanding what loneliness is during loneliness awareness, we can do that all year round, of course.
Yeah.
And I think again, I guess my take-home message is all of us can do a part, and when are you going to do yours?
Thanks for tuning in.
It's a Minefield is produced by Chris Jaeger,
Hannah Achilles.
and Leon Fernandez.
Audio by Lockie Hilda.
We're kindly supported by the Mental Health Commission of New South Wales. You can reach out to us at iamf.org.au. And remember, we're all in this together.